It's been way too long since I posted an update, and I am sorry about that. There's also been some confusion about the new formatting requirements on the board, which I've cleared up. So the next few stories are going to be posted a little bit differently. They'll be in chronological order. I'll do my best to tie them into each other as much as possible, so it doesn't skip around too much. When I started out as a rookie, no one told me about all the weird things that would happen. I'm guessing this is largely to prevent me from freaking out and abandoning the park. But a few months into my service, when I was still a rookie, a friend and I were drunk at a party, and he opened up a bit. Yeah, it can get a little crazy out here, I guess. I think the worst is when people die that just shouldn't, you know? Or we find them dead, and like 10 minutes after someone said they saw them. They were fine when I passed them on the switchback, I swear. That sort of shit. Like, take this guy who I found one spring. He was out on a really popular trail. Someone comes into the VC freaking out about some guy who's laying in the middle of the path in the giant pool of blood. So, we run out there. We find this guy dead as a doornail. Which he absolutely should be, because the back of his head is like mashed potatoes. His skull is just decimated. Brains are leaking out like custard filling. And this guy's old, so you figure, yeah, he probably fell and hit his head. Old people fall all the time, no big deal. Except the area where he fell doesn't have any big rocks. There aren't even any stumps or tree branches. And on top of that, there is no blood trail. So he clearly died where he dropped. Now, that's when you turn to murder. But there were people just out of the line of sight of the guy. If someone came up and murdered him, there's no way they wouldn't have heard it. And again, if someone had, there would be a blood trail, or splatter all over the place. But everyone on the scene said it looked exactly like he had fallen and smashed his head on the rock. So what the fuck did he hit his head on? And then there was this lady I found in a different park about 5 years ago, back when I was in a different part of the state. We found her in the middle of a stand of big junipers curled around the trunk, like she was hugging it. We picked her up to move her, and a fucking waterfall comes out of her mouth, splashes all over my shoes. Her clothes are dry, her hair is dry, but the amount of water in her stomach and lungs was phenomenal. It was just unreal, man. Coroner's report says the cause of death was drowning. Her lungs were completely full of water. This, even though we're in the middle of the high desert and there isn't a body of water around for miles, no puddles, no nothing. No sign of anyone else being out there. I mean, yeah, it's possible she was murdered, but why go out of your way to do it like that? Why not just stab him and be done with it? I don't know. Just sits weird with me, I guess. Now, of course, that freaked me out a little bit. But we were wasted. I guess I sort of wrote it off as a fluke. I also assumed there was exaggeration there, since, we were wasted. Now, I don't like talking about this next case very much. It was just an awful one, and I've done my best to forget about it. But of course, that is easier said than done. This happened about 6 months after the conversation with my friend at the bar, and up until that point, I hadn't really had any weird shit go down. A few things here and there, and of course, well, the stairs, but amazingly easy to get used to stuff like that when it's just treated as normal. This case, however, was it was a bit different. A guy with Down syndrome in his 20s went missing after his family lost sight of him on a major path. That was odd in and of itself because the kid never left his mom's side. She was absolutely convinced that he had been kidnapped. And unfortunately, a ranger who isn't with the park anymore insinuated that no one would want to kidnap someone, well, with that kind of disability. Not very tactful to say the least. We wasted a lot of time trying to get her to calm down, just enough to get information about him. and we put out an official missing persons call. Because of the urgency of the situation, him mostly unable to function alone, we had the local police come in and help us. We didn't find him in the first night, which was just heartbreaking. None of us wanted to think of him being alone out there. We assumed he had just kept wandering and was staying ahead of us. We broke out heedless the next day and spotted him in a little canyon. I helped to bring him back up, but he was in bad shape. And I think we all knew that he wasn't going to make it. He had fallen and broken his spine and he couldn't feel his lower half. He'd also broken both of his legs. One at the femur. He lost a lot of blood. He was confused and scared while he was alone. So he probably exacerbated his injuries by dragging himself a little ways. I know it sounds awful, but while I was riding in the copter with him, I asked him why he wandered off. I just wanted something to tell his mother, to let her know that it wasn't her fault. Because he was fading fast and I didn't think she would get to ask him herself. He was crying, and he said something about how the little sad boy wanted him to come and play. He said the little sad boy wanted to trade so he could go home. Then he closed his eyes, and when he woke up again, he was in the canyon. I'm not sure that's exactly what he said, but it's what I thought was the gist of it anyway. He kept crying, asking where his mommy was. I held his hand and tried my best to keep him calm. It was cold out there, he kept saying. It was cold out there. My legs were frozen. It was cold out there. It's cold in me. He was getting weaker, so eventually he stopped talking, and he closed his eyes for a while. Then when we were about 5 minutes from the hospital, he looked right at me with big tears running down his face. He said, "Mama won't see me no more. Love Mama. Wish she was here." And he closed his eyes and he just never woke up. It was horrible. I don't like talking about it. That was one of the first cases that really rattled me badly. Because of how badly it affected me, I reached out to a senior ranger who ended up helping me through it. As time went on, we got to know each other better. He ended up sharing one of his own stories with me. It was disturbing, but it helped knowing that I wasn't the only one affected by the things going on out here. I think this must have been before you got here. I think if it happened while you were here, you would have remembered it. I know it didn't end up on the news for some reason, but I think most people who have been here long enough kind of know about it. The park sold off a portion of land to a logging company. It was a real controversial thing, but it wasn't that large or old of a plot. And it was right after the recession, so we needed the cash badly. Anyway, they were felling this plot of land and we got the call that we needed to get our supervisors out there right away. I don't know why, but they ended up sending me and a few other guys along with the heads. I guess powers and numbers? To see what was up. When we got there, we saw all these guys crowded around a tree that they had just cut down. They're all pissed off and freaking out, and the foreman comes over and he wants to know what we think we're up to. "What the hell y'all think this is? Some kind of sick joke? You've got a lot of fucking nerve pulling this shit. We bought this land fair and square." Well, we don't know what the hell he's talking about, so he brings us over to this felled tree and points at us and tells us it was like this when they cut it down. And that they'll be damned if they put it there. The inside of the tree was rotted and hollowed out in one spot. When they cut it down, it exposed that chamber. And inside of it is a hand. Like a perfectly severed hand. It looks like it's actually been fused inside of the tree. Now, we think that they're pulling some kind of sick joke. So we tell them that we don't like being fucked with and that we're gonna leave. But they tell us that they already called the cops and that they'll go right to the media if we don't stick around. Well, that gets the head's attention, so they stick around and talk to the police about it. Everyone is denying they put the hand in the tree, and besides, how would anyone have even done it? It's clearly a real hand. It's not mummified or skeletal. It's brand new, probably not even a day old, and it's fused with the wood. You can see how this is coming out, right? The loggers, they insist they didn't put it there, but somehow a fresh human hand ended up fused inside of a living tree. The cops have them cut out that section of the tree into a movable chunk. Then they take it away, and the area is closed off. There was a pretty big investigation, but as far as I know, they didn't get any answers. Now it's kind of become a legend, and as far as I know, we haven't sold off any more property for logging. As well as you know, I've been to a training seminar recently, and I've heard some pretty amazing and horrible things there. One of the guys I talked to was telling me a story one night around the campfire. We were both pretty drunk. You'll start to see a pattern here. And we were all swapping stories. He told me this one. Me and another guy were out on a field research for campers that reported hearing screaming noises at night. So we head out there for whatever fucking mountain lion had wandered into the area. And I am pissed. I've seen 3 of them show up in the camping areas that year alone, and I'm getting tired as hell of constantly having to deal with them. Plus, I just don't fucking like them anyway. They're a pain in the ass, they're loud, and they scare the shit out of me. Fucking cats. Pieces of shit. I'm groaning, and the guy I'm with thinks it's a real fucking riot. So we start seeing all these broken branches and what looks like dens, so we're pretty sure we know where the fucking thing is. So I call it in and they tell me to confirm if possible, which they want to know if I step in a big pile of shit and use that as proof. I'm not seeing any though, so I basically tell them to shove it and that I'm done. We know where this damn thing is out here, even if I'm not stepping in its shit or its big fucking mouth or whatever. Guy I'm with wanders off to take a piss, so I'm standing behind watching this little burrow under a tree to see if maybe a fox or something is living under it. 'Cause I love foxes, man. They're cute as hell. Anyway, I'm watching this tree and I start to hear these branches crackling, and it's coming from the direction opposite my partner went. Now, I've got my pistol, and you and I both know that's not gonna do shit against a cat. So I cock it and holler for my partner to get his dumb ass back. He's gone too far. He can't hear me. So I stand up and get my sights on where the thing is approaching. And I fucking shit you not, man. I just about peed myself. This guy is coming towards me, and he's backflipping through the fucking woods. Like, instead of walking, he's doing these crazy fucking backflips. I swear to God, he cleared every log and bush in his path. It's like he knew exactly where he was going. I yell at the guy to stop where he is and that I'm pointing a gun at him. But he keeps coming. And I just kinda lost it. I shot the ground in front of him. It was a dumb fucking thing to do. But man, I didn't want this guy anywhere near me. When I fired, he was about 50 yards away. And as soon as my gun goes off, he whirls around and starts backflipping back into the woods. My partner hears my gun go off and he runs back and asks what's up. I tell him that there's some fucking weirdo out here hopped up on God knows what, and that we need to get the fuck out of Dodge. I let the cops know what happened, and I didn't get any trouble for firing. But man, I don't know what that motherfucker was on, but I've never seen anything like it before. Shit was absolutely buttfuck crazy. I think we can agree that there's stuff going on out in the woods. While I'm not going to spout off about what it could be or offer any theories, what I want people to take away from this is that it is so damn important to be safe while you're out there. I know a lot of you think you're invincible, but the fact is, you can die out there, or get hurt, or go missing. It's easier than you'd ever imagine. I apologize for this relatively short update, guys. I will absolutely do my best to continue this series as soon as possible. Thank you for all the continuing support. It does mean the world to me. One of the topics I get asked about a lot, on here and in real life, involve things like the Rake, the Wendigo, and other related legends. I can't honestly say that I know a lot about them, but based on some light reading I did, I can say that I've heard stories that seem loosely related to them. You've heard the old adage that legends like that come from somewhere, right? And I'm sure that's true. But as you all know, I try to take things with a grain of salt. You kind of have to out here. It's sort of like working in a hospital, I'd imagine. You could spend all day thinking about how many people have died there, and how there are probably ghosts, or whatever you want to call them, all over the place. But it doesn't do you any good. It just makes it harder for you to do your job. I think a lot of us feel that way, and that's why we just go on and pretend like everything is fine. Once you get paranoid, there's not really any going back. A lot of cadets quit because of it. My park especially seems to have a high turnover rate, because cadets graduate, get so freaked out about everything, and they just seem to not be able to let it go. You have to learn to internalize things and just shut it off. I talked to Katie about her experiences because I wanted to know what she thought about the Wendigo. She didn't really have anything particular to say about it. Aside from that, she didn't like to think about it very much. But a friend of hers told her something similar that had happened. I contacted this person, H, over Skype, and they agreed to talk to me a bit. They're aware of my work here, and they're fine with me posting the story exactly as they told me. I grew up in Central Oregon, and there's a reservation called Warm Springs, about 1 or 2 hours from where I lived. I only mention that because a lot of people in my area had friends there, and a lot of the land in that area belongs to that tribe. When I grew up as a kid, we used to go camping there. Not on the res, of course, but in that area. I met a lot of kids who grew up there. I got to know one kid pretty well. His name was Nolan. We ended up hanging out a lot when our families were in the area. Our folks would get in touch with each other so we could all go camping around the same time. We'd camp out for about 2 weeks, so we were out there for a long time. I asked him if he camped in an RV. Yeah, my dad had one. So I guess it wasn't really camping, but we'd take our tents and stuff and set them up away from camp most nights. I didn't like sleeping in the RV because, well, I like being outside. We talked a bit about camping. Anyway, sorry. One year, Nolan and I were out there. I think I must have been 12 or so. We wanted to go camp near a river because we wanted to try night fishing. I think that we must have been about 1/3 of a mile away from the main camp. Far enough that we couldn't hear or see anyone else. I remember that. We were messing around most of the day. I don't really remember much about it, but we ended up building a fire at some point. And I remember being really impressed because he had a flint or something that he used to start it. I've never seen anyone do that before, so I thought it was really cool. I got him to teach me how to do it, and we lit some stuff on fire. Looking back, it was pretty stupid because it was in the middle of fucking summer, and I remember the fire warning was at an either yellow or an orange. But thankfully, we didn't start anything major. And when it got dark, we sat around and talked about whatever it is 12-year-olds talk about. I don't even remember. What I do remember is that, at some point, he looked over my shoulder at the river, and he asked me if I could see something. The way our camp was set up, we were about 10 feet from the river, and we were at its widest point, so I think it was probably 12 feet to the other bank. It gets hot up there in the summer, but the water's still cold, which is important. I looked over my shoulder and I could see something wading into the water from the other side. From where we were, it looked kind of like a deer, but I couldn't really tell because of the fire. I got up to look closer and I saw a pair of antlers, so I figured that it was a buck. But I thought that it was weird that it was wading into the water, and it was definitely headed for us. I asked Nolan what he thought we should do. He looked at the fire with this weird expression, and he tells me to sit down and shut up. So I do, because I've never seen him act that way before. He's whispering at me to ignore it, but he just keeps talking like he couldn't think of anything to say. He keeps saying something about an episode of some show. but I can hear the deer coming through the water, so I wasn't paying attention to him. I keep trying to look over his shoulder, and every time I did, he would sort of hit me in the arm and make me look at him. I remember I wasn't really scared, but just sort of confused. But then I hear the deer come out of the water, and I could kind of make out what it looked like. I realized it wasn't a deer because whatever it was walking on 2 legs. I started to get up. I was super freaked out, but Nolan yanked me down and talked louder about this television show. I could tell that he was probably just as scared as I was, probably even more. He leaned in and started poking the fire with the stick, and he whispered, "Whatever I do, I can't speak to it." I could see it come closer, and it stood right behind Nolan's back. I was about ready to pee my pants, and I think I probably would have run if I had been alone, but I didn't want to leave Nolan. So I kept sitting really still, sneaking glances at it. It wasn't that tall, but the way it carried itself was just wrong. Like its center of balance was screwed up. I can't really describe it, but it kind of like kept shifting forward too far. It just stood there, behind Nolan for a long time, and eventually Nolan ran out of things to say. We just kind of sat there for a second. The fire was making noise, but I could hear this thing, whatever it was, talking in kind of a really low voice. I couldn't hear what it was saying, and I leaned in a little bit, and I actually did pee my pants when I leaned forward too. I couldn't see its face, but I did see its eyes. They were cloudy and milky. If you want to know what they look like, find that scene from Lord of the Rings where Frodo falls into that lake and all the dead people are floating toward him. That's what its eyes looked like. So all I saw were these 2 milky white things floating above Nolan's head, and a really vague shape of antlers coming out. I don't know what my face looked like, but at exactly the same time, Nolan and I fucking booked it out of there. We ran non-stop until we got back to the main camp. My pants were soaked with pee, so I took them off while we were running and threw them into the bushes. We both stopped once we were in front of my dad's RV. We couldn't see the thing chasing us, so we just stood there and caught our breath. I asked him what it was, and he said he didn't know. He said his grandpa had only warned him that if anything ever came up to him when he was out in the desert, he should never, ever talk to it or listen to what it has to say. I wanted to know if he'd heard it talking too. He said that he was only able to understand "help you." I think we ended up sleeping in the RV with my parents, and the next night we went back to see if we could find anything, but we couldn't see anything. That does, in a lot of ways, remind me of the Wendigo legend. There's a phrase used to describe it that I think fits perfectly, which is that the Wendigo is the spirit of the lonely places. I know sometimes when I'm out in the wilds, where I know there's no one around for miles and miles, I get this weird craving that I can't really explain. I don't know if this happens to anyone else, but it's just this desire to consume. It's not like I crave anything in particular, but more of this weird, distracting hunger that comes from every part of my gut. I also wanted to find out more about the Faceless Man if I was able to, and I found a few similar things. I asked around my circle of friends, and one of them said that they were doing repairs at this park in the area, and he saw something kind of like that. We were having dinner in town, 5 of us, including myself. This guy, he was repainting an information booth, and he heard a man ask him for directions to the nearest campsite. He didn't turn around because he was up on a ladder, but he informed the man that there weren't any campsites nearby, but if he headed down the road about 4 miles, he'd find one at the national park. He asked if he could be of any other help, and the man said no, and thanked him. My friend said he kept painting, but he was listening, and he never heard the other man leave. The second he came up and talked to me, the hairs on my neck stood up, but I wasn't sure why. I just had this really uneasy feeling about the whole thing. I just wanted to finish painting and get the hell out of there. I figured part of that was because I couldn't turn around to look at him. but something definitely felt off. There was also this weird smell floating around before the guy even talked to me, kind of like old period blood. I had looked around to see what was causing it, but I didn't see anything. So I waited for the guy to walk away, but I didn't hear him leave, which made me think he was just standing there and watching me. So I asked if I could do anything for him, and he didn't answer. I knew he was there, though, because I haven't heard him leave. So I did this awkward turn on the ladder to look at him and to see what he was doing. Now, I admit, it could have just been my brain fucking up for a second, but I swear to you, Russ, for a split second when I turned around, that fucker didn't have a face. Like, he had no face. It was almost concave and totally smooth. I just about had a fucking heart attack and I couldn't even wrap my brain around what I was seeing. I think I started to say something, but there was this kind of pop inside my head and suddenly he was just a normal looking guy. I must have looked weird because he asked me if I was okay. And I said, yeah, I'm fine. He asks about the campsite again and I point out where he has to go. He's like, I'm not from around here. Can you help me get there? Now, that's when I knew something was really up, because no way this guy got out here and had no idea where he was. And for that matter, there was no car around. So how'd he get here in the first place? I said I couldn't take him anywhere in the company vehicle, and he's like, please? I really don't know where I am. Can you come with me and help me get there? Now I'm seriously weirded out, and I start wondering if this is some kind of ambush or whatever. I told him I could call him a taxi to take him where he wants to go. I pull out my phone and he just goes, no, and walks away really quickly. But he doesn't walk out of the park. He walks back into the fucking trees. I got right in my fucking truck and got out of there. Fuck the paint or whatever I was working on. I looked into my mirror to see where he was as I was leaving, and he was standing right in the tree line again. I don't know how he could have gotten there so fast, but this time I know that fucker didn't have a face. He just watched me leave. Right before I turned the corner, he took a big step back into the trees and kind of dissolved. I guess. Maybe it was just so dark he blended in, but it looked more like he just melted away. Interestingly, right after this guy finished his story, someone else piped up with another one, but with a slightly different twist. You know, actually, I had something weird happen to me like that a while back. I was out doing some trail scouting and I was in the middle of nowhere, figured out where we were going to have to run this trail through. I hadn't seen anyone for probably a good 2 hours, so I wasn't really paying attention to where I was going. I was just looking at the ground for the most part. Then, out of nowhere, I crested this little hill and ran right into this guy. He was older, probably in his 60s, and I started to apologize for running into him. Then I noticed his face. I probably looked like a complete douchebag because I stopped and just stared at him. It took me a second to figure out what was wrong with this guy's face, but it was huge. I know it sounds weird, but that's the best way I can describe it. His head wasn't big or anything, that was pretty normal, but the amount of space his face took up was just way too much. Like, if you look at someone's face and enlarge it by 2 times, kind of like that. He doesn't say anything, he just kind of looks at me. I back up and was kind of stuttering and kept saying how sorry I was. Went around him and got the fuck out of there to do what I needed to do. The whole time, I kept looking behind me because I didn't want this dude to just pop up or something. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I swear to you, that was one of the creepiest things I have ever seen. I switched the topic to the stairs a little bit later. There was a definite switch in enthusiasm. No one spoke up at first. There was a real stigma about discussing them, even when we are away from work. I broke the ice with a story of my own. And the guy who told the story about the faceless man told this one, albeit pretty quietly. A couple years ago, I was camping with my girlfriend. We were out about 2 miles from the road at this one site I know. We went to bed that night, but we couldn't sleep because, Someone interjected with a funny off-color comment. We were all dangerously close to going off on another subject, but I got us back on track. Yeah, real funny, fucker. No, it was because we kept hearing this grinding noise. My brother used to grind his teeth in his sleep, and it kind of reminded me of that. My girlfriend was absolutely freaking out, but I just kept telling her to ignore it because I've heard it before. You just kind of have to ignore it. It does eventually go away. You guys know what I mean. We all knew what he meant. So eventually, I get her to go to sleep, but I woke up probably 2 hours later because something was just off. I rolled over and she wasn't there. I kind of freaked out because he thought for a second, then took a very long drink. Anyway, I ran out of the tent calling her name, but she didn't go far. She was standing right at the edge of the camp, looking at something in the trees that I couldn't see. She was really pale. The fire was low but bright enough to see. Anyway, I ran up to see what she was doing, and she was dead asleep. But her eyes were open. She had this real spaced out look, you know? So I put my arm around her to lead her back, but she wouldn't move. She just said really quietly something like, "I have to go now, Eddie. I have to go. It's here." I was like, "You're just sleepwalking. Come on, let's go back to bed." But she wouldn't budge. She just kept standing there saying that she had to go. I looked where she was looking, and there was a fucking staircase right there, maybe 15 yards away. Gray one, concrete. She started to walk towards it, but I yanked her back and that woke her up. She looked at me like I was out of my fucking mind, and she asked what the fuck she's doing out of the tent. I didn't tell her anything. I just told her that she was sleepwalking. The grinding was gone, so she just went back to the tent and fell asleep again. I don't know. I just don't like thinking about it, you know? We all knew what he meant. You guys remember that kid with I can't remember what it was. Some kind of brain fuck up? Not Downs, but something like it. Someone else brought it up. Well, I got to read the report he gave when they found him about a week after he went missing, and it was fucked up beyond belief. I mean, you have to take it with a grain of salt because who knows what the kid actually thinks is real, but some of this stuff, I don't think he could have made it up. Like what? Well, first of all, he talked about the stairs. He said he had been watching his dad build a fire and the stairs came up to him. He said he had to go up them or something bad would happen. The cops didn't really understand what he was talking about after that, but he just kept saying, like the campfire, over and over and over. He kept mentioning sounds, but he couldn't say what sounds. Just that it was loud and he covered his ears so he couldn't hear them. But the thing I remember most is, when they asked him where exactly he had gone, he said, "I was right here." And he kept pointing at himself. And they thought that he meant that he had never left. He said that he wasn't scared because the stairs were there, and they talked to him, but not like people talk. Like I said, it was really convoluted and hard to understand, and I have the feeling the cops didn't take most of it down. They just ended up saying that the kid had some kind of amnesia or fugue. They didn't think any foul play was involved. Doesn't really explain why he came back a week later, perfectly fine without a speck of dirt on him, and well fed. But hey, what the cops say goes. There's still a lot of questions that I want to answer. I'll continue to ask around and find out whatever I can. The next update should be soon though. Thank you for being patient. This is going to be my final update for now. Things have deteriorated here to a degree that I couldn't foresee. I didn't know exactly how much writing about these things that are happening here would affect every single aspect of my life, and maybe it was stupid of me. Maybe I should have considered it more seriously, but honestly, I just thought that I was writing about a few things that people would want to hear. I didn't think it would get this much attention. People ask me about the stairs now. It doesn't happen every day, but it does happen, and I never really know what to say. My bosses know that someone is talking about them. I'm sure that if they know, the higher-ups know, and I can tell you that they are not happy about it. I have been formally told that I am not to speak a word about them to anyone anymore, which is part of the reason that this is my final update. I can't risk my job for this. As much as it's been wonderful to get to know you and to get all these things off my mind, I still do love my work. I need to be out there. If anything, my being aware of what's really going on is enough reason to stick it out. I may not be able to tell people what's out here, but if I see them, I can direct traffic somewhere safer. Because of the amount of attention these stories have gotten, I've heard a lot of stories being swapped back and forth. I've heard so many that I can't even remember most of them. The ones that I do remember, I wish I could forget. One of the stories that made the rounds was a young woman who had disappeared upstate. Initially, everyone assumed that she was a runaway. She didn't come from a great home life, so it wasn't really a surprise that she had chosen to just cut and run. But people started coming forward saying that they had seen her around the park shortly before she vanished. So some of the rangers in the area were sent out to make sure she hadn't hung herself or something on any of the back trails. It took them a while, but they did find her. Well, not all of her. Just half of her tongue and a quarter of her lower jaw. Very clean cuts from what I've heard. They never found the rest of her. So many stories about children. So many of them going missing and turning up in caves, wedged in impossibly tight spaces. So many of them found on mountain peaks or at the bottom of sheer gullies. Missing shoes, missing socks, or with both, found in perfectly good condition despite being miles and miles away from where they vanished. So many stories about black-eyed people wandering around the woods calling out into the night, mimicking the sounds of running water or bobcats screaming. One man in particular goes to every news station he thinks will listen to him, and he tells them all the same story. He was deer hunting and he was camped out in a very remote area of the park, and he was woken up because of something scraping against his tent. He thought that it was a raccoon or a fox, until the thing pressed its face against the door of the tent, at which point he could make out that it clearly had a human nose and mouth. He kicked at it, but it leaped back and was gone by the time he opened up the tent flap, gun at his side. He fired 2 warning shots, but when the sound faded, he heard a twig snap behind him. There was a man standing at the edge of the campsite. This man was not wearing any clothing. He also didn't possess any kind of human flesh. As the hunter described it, it looked like an amalgamation of raw meat and hair, as if someone had scooped up roadkill and molded it into a vague shape of a man. His face was lumpy, and it only had the rough approximation of an actual human face. The thing opened its lopsided mouth, and the sound came out of it was the sound of the gun that the hunter had fired earlier. It did this twice before mimicking the sound of the zipper, and then just fleeing off into the night. Another story is one of a young couple out for a hike in one of the more rocky areas of the park. This was reported to me yesterday, that they had seen something strange out on a peak that I'm very familiar with. They were taking turns looking through binoculars when the man noticed a hiker climbing up a very steep part of the cliff face. He watched the man scale the slope, but it didn't occur to him until after the incident was over that this person had no climbing gear. When the climber reached the top of the peak, which was about 5 miles away, he then turned and faced the young man. He said whoever or whatever this person was looking right at him. The climber waved in an exaggerated manner before snapping himself in half at the waist, sideways, and leaping off the peak. The young man didn't say where the climber landed, I sent them on their way with assurances that I would have it checked out. I lied. I won't be turning in a report because there are 10 others exactly like it. The climber is well known in the area. I don't even question it anymore. There are so many things that I will never understand about my job, and it would take me years to relate all of the things that I've heard over the past few months. When my job isn't in jeopardy, I will come back. It may be in a different format, but I'll come back. Thank you all for sticking by my side and enjoying the things I've talked about. If you do go out in the woods, I encourage you to be safe. Bring food, water, survival equipment. Let people know where you're going and when you'll be back. Do not go on uncharted paths unless you know exactly what you're doing. And above all, don't touch them, don't look at them, don't go up them. Well guys, that is the end of probably the creepypasta that got me into creepypastas. Make sure you go show the author some love. I'll link that down in the description as usual. I'm going to take this opportunity to thank my beautiful, lovely, and sexy as always $10 and above patrons in order: Dan R, Paul Z, Mr. Swiston, Official Jerboa, Chaos X, JY Pyromancer, Hayden MH, and welcome new patron Ethan A. How you doing, buddy? Glad you decided to join. If you want your name read off and you want access to some Patreon only stuff, head over to the Patreon link down below. I really appreciate it.